Aye.
All right, welcome back, everyone. We are taking up business on S-131, an act relating to the approval of an amendment to the charter of the city of Burlington relating to the possession of firearms. We're going to start off with Tucker Anderson, Legislative Counsel. How are you, sir?
Good morning. For the record, Tucker Anderson, Legislative Counsel. I am fantastic. I'm hoping that my hair is in order and my bow tie is in order for this morning. You have to be corrected on the record. You have in front of you S-131 as passed by the Senate. It proposes one amendment to the charter of the city of Burlington, which was approved by the voters on March 4th, 2025. Section 1, you are familiar with because it is in all of the charters that this committee considers. It is the approval of the charter amendments as they have been proposed. Section 2 contains the operative provision, which is adding a section 510 to the city's charter, containing a ban on firearms in premises that are licensed to serve alcoholic beverages. If at any point you want to visit the definitions, licenses for alcoholic beverages, I am happy to do that. The one area where I will quickly find myself over my skis, and I would defer to my colleague Eric Fitzpatrick, is any in-depth analysis and questions on firearms. I want to note that up front that you should drag Eric in for those questions. Subsection A starts by superseding statutes in Title 24. These are preemption statutes that are being superseded. This section expressly supersedes 24 VSA sections 2291 subdivision 8 and 2295, authorizing the city to regulate the possession and carrying of firearms pursuant to the provisions of this section 510. Subsection B contains the ban. Within the city, no person may knowingly possess a firearm as defined by 13 VSA section 4016 subdivision A3. There are a few definitions of firearms. This is a specific definition. It again would defer to Eric Fitzpatrick on the distinction between those firearms definitions. In any premises licensed to serve alcoholic beverages. A few key terms to pick out there. First, the standard is knowingly possess, something that if you bring Eric in, he will describe the standard for knowing. The second thing to point out is these are premises licensed to serve alcoholic beverages. And serve is an important term because it is calling out those premises where you are consuming alcoholic beverages on the premises. Later on, there will be specific exceptions that call out types of alcoholic beverage licenses, but in general, we will be talking about on-premises service of alcoholic beverages. Subsection C, we have the exceptions to the ban. Provision shall not apply to subdivision 1A. These are the places exceptions. A second-class licensed premises, including premises used for a retail alcoholic beverage tasting permit. To unpack this, because you haven't done a lot of alcoholic beverage work this year, the second-class license are your retail outlets that are selling closed containers of alcoholic beverages for off-premises consumption. Grocery stores, gas stations, 802 Spirits locations. These are refrigerators, boxes of alcoholic beverages that are being purchased and taken home or to wherever the final destination is for consumption, not being consumed on premises. The committee likely recalls from some of the alcoholic beverages bills that came up last biennium that there are locations where you have overlapping licenses, but here the exception calls out the premises, the defined area for a second-class license. Subdivision 1B. Sidewalks or public highways that pass through an outside premises for which a licensee holds an outside consumption permit. So your first and third class licenses, which are your on-premises licenses, restaurants and bars may apply for and receive an outside consumption permit where they can set out an outside serving zone. If you have walked through a metropolitan area in Vermont, you have likely seen these outside consumption areas outside of restaurants, for example, where there are tables and chairs and then a tidy little rope marking where the serving area is. That is a permitted area subject to an outside consumption permit. What subdivision 1B is carving out here is anywhere where the sidewalk or a public highway, aka town road, is intersecting the serving area. Are you with me? Subdivision 1C, the next place exception. Premises for which a licensee holds a limited event permit, a special event permit, or a special event serving permit. Last biennium, some of these permits were updated and almost all of them now contain the term event. So it's a little confusing. But that first permit in the list, the limited event. These are permits that are granted to events such as a weekend music event. I think there was one that was brought up last biennium. It was like the Spring Onion event or Spring Onion Festival. Allows the permit holder to serve alcoholic beverages at that sort of event. Banjo Fest, right? It does not include, for example, Brewfest, which is a sampling event permit. So Brewfest is still covered. It's not granted an exception here. Special events permits, the next item in the list. This is a pop-up tent, a temporary location that is used by a manufacturer within another event where the manufacturer is selling their own products or offering samples of their own products from that limited service area. Special event serving permit. This is the most recent permit worked on by the General Assembly. And if you'll recall last session, these are your retail locations that have temporary alcoholic beverage serving areas set up. Bookstores, art museums, museums, art galleries, and most recently, retail establishments can acquire this permit for not more than 4 days. Subdivision D, the last exception for places. A dining car for which a licensee holds a promotional railroad tasting permit. And if you were not confused by the labyrinth of alcoholic beverage licenses so far, point of clarification here, this provides an exception to those dining cars where the permit holder is offering tastings of alcoholic beverages. Exception does not apply to a dining car for which the owner holds a first or third class license. So like a fully operational restaurant that serves malt, vinous, ready to drink spirits beverages, ciders, or spirits. Subdivision 2, we get into the people exceptions. This does not apply to a firearm possessed by any federal, state, or local law enforcement officer acting within the scope of the officer's duties. Subdivision B, any member of the armed forces of the United States or the Vermont National Guard acting within the scope of that person's duties. Subdivision C, any government officer, agent, or employee authorized to carry a weapon and acting within the scope of that person's duties. And in subdivision D, the holder of the license for the premises. So we're going back to the alcoholic beverage licenses here, provided that person is not prohibited from possessing or carrying that weapon under applicable law. Something to note here that has come up in discussion quite a bit is that for the most part, the holder of the license for a premises is likely going to be a corporation. It's not always the case, at least just based on the way that these licenses are registered Currently, you can find individuals who are listed as the license holder. Even within the city of Burlington, if you pull up the license holder list, you can identify individuals. But for the most part, these are corporations, and the exception would not be useful for those corporations. They're legal people, but not human being people. Subsection D articulates the penalties. The penalty for any violation of the section shall be, in subdivision 1, if you're with me on page 3, for criminal offenses. Any violation may be considered a criminal offense, which shall be punishable by a fine of not more than $1,000 or imprisonment for not more than 90 days. Subdivision 2. This is an either and. Any violation of this section may also be considered a civil ordinance violation punishable by a civil penalty of not less than $200 and not more than $500. There has also been discussion about this penalty section. In particular, some of the discussion and debate focused around 24 VSA, section 1971 and 1974, dealing with the general laws governing the adoption of ordinances and the penalties associated with ordinances. And under general law, a municipality is prohibited from adopting an ordinance that has both criminal and civil penalties. They must choose either one or the other. Here, the city will not be adopting an ordinance. The General Assembly is adopting state law that applies to the city of Burlington exclusively and putting it into the charter. There will not be an ordinance adopted under this. You are not delegating legislative authority. You are saying what the law will be. And in this penalty provision, you are allowing expressly for both criminal and civil penalties for the violation of this section of law. The effective date, as with all the other charters, is on passage.
Thank you for that run through. I would like to hold questions for council and move over to Senator Vahofsky. We kind of did that like in reverse, but I wanted to do the meat of the content as we had not done any immersive work on alcohol policy, just to sort of set the table with baseline knowledge. Thank you for your patience, Senator.
Absolutely. For the record, Senator Tanya Vahofsky, I represent the Chittenden Central District, which does include most of Burlington. What is going to be most helpful for you all to have from my perspective? I can run through sort of an overview of my floor report, or I can give you some of the data around Burlington.
I think right now, there's some of the data around Burlington and maybe just some of the context of how this transpired and what led to the introduction of this.
Absolutely. So I'm sure everyone here notes that an S charter change is a little atypical. But it is not in rule that charters have to start in the House. It is simply tradition. And that is largely because your Rules Committee exempts charters from crossover deadlines, and that's not true on the Senate side. But it is not the first time I've seen a charter, even just in my short time in the Senate. Senator Mazza introduced a charter into the Government Operations Committee last year, and it was in fact a charter that hadn't even been voted on yet by the people of the town that he was introducing it for. So the charter change arena is interesting. Anyways. So this charter is for the city of Burlington, and the first time that Burlington voted on this charter was actually back in 2014. In 2014, 68% of the voters voted to support this charter, and I'm not going to speculate on what was happening in these spaces in 2014 as to why that charter never made it off the wall, never made it through the process. But in spite of the fact that the city actually does not need to revote a charter, once a charter has been voted, we can just keep reintroducing it until hopefully it makes it through. In 2025, they decided to put it back on the ballot in Burlington. And in 2025, the charter passed with 86.6% of those voting to support it. So it's pretty clear to me that the support for this charter in Burlington has not diminished in the last 11 years. It's in fact grown quite significantly. And towards the end here, I've got the actual numbers of people that came out to vote for or against this charter in both of those cycles. So that is a little bit about how this came to be. I can't speak to why Senator Baruth decided to introduce this on the Senate side rather than the House side. I could speculate, but I don't think that's a good idea. But as the charter came to us, the language was the exact same language that had come to us in 2014. And as people probably know, the sort of landscape around firearm legislation has changed pretty significantly since 2014. And there was concern that as the language was drafted, it may not hold up under the Bruen decision. There was some vagueness in it. And so we worked really hard to tailor the language to do what the voters of Burlington asked us to do, which was ban the carrying of firearms in places that serve alcohol, while not being too vague to hold up under Bruen. So under Bruen, Councilor Fitzpatrick can dive much deeper into this than I can, but under Bruen, it has been upheld that places that serve alcohol can be considered sensitive places, and therefore you can regulate firearms in those spaces. Not only are there historical analogs to this, there are actually multiple historical twins, places throughout history where it was explicitly in law that you cannot carry a firearm in bars. I have a list of many of them that were cited in a recent Second Circuit court decision upholding New York's ban on firearms in bars. But for example, in 1853, New Mexico prohibited firearms at all balls or fandangos in any room adjoining said ball where liquors are sold.
Fandango.
I actually can. It is a fandango is a lively Spanish dance. Yes. In 1870, San Antonio, Texas banned firearms in any bar room or drinking saloon. And again, I have many more. I can keep going, but I won't waste your time with that. And if people want them, I can send more, as can Eric Fitzpatrick. But this is not a new idea. This is an idea that is well in line with the history of firearms regulations in this country. And currently, there are 15 states that have some sort of prohibition on the carrying of firearms in bars. So I'm going to skip the language because Tucker Anderson did a much better job going through that as an attorney than I will. The vote in 2014 in Burlington was 5,194 voting yes to this prohibition and 2,437 voting no. And in 2025, the vote was 8,335 voting yes and 1,284 voting no. So I think, again, you can see quite overwhelmingly that the support for this has increased. And in fact, there are fewer people voting. While more people overall voted in 2025, fewer people voted no than in 2014. And I do want to circle back to the fact that, again, this is a charter change. This is an exercise in democracy. Our job as the legislature in a Dillon's Rule state is to ensure that the policies we are passing are not blatantly unconstitutional, and this charter change is not, and not blatantly discriminatory, and this charter change is not. I don't view my role as a senator to stand in the way of the democratic process for a municipality. And I personally voted on charters that I wouldn't have voted for as a voter, but stood up to those critiques. So as I see it, this isn't about whether or not you agree with the policy. It's about whether or not we believe in local control. The voters of Burlington have spoken quite clearly to want to institute some common sense public safety policy. You know, we've heard a lot of rhetoric around Burlington in the last few years. And while Burlington remains the fourth safest city in the nation, there has been an increase in gun crime, and the residents of Burlington are asking for a tool in their toolbox. As a clinical social worker and someone with an undergraduate degree in behavioral neuroscience, what I know is that there is no amount of alcohol that doesn't impact our judgment. And alcohol tends to make us act more rationally, have increased emotions. And as a gun owner myself, who's taken many gun safety classes, one of the first things impressed on me at every one of them is alcohol and guns simply do not mix. And so that is the context of how we got here and the work that the Senate committee did to tailor the language to make sure that it does what the voters of Burlington asked us to without being constitutional, to provide them a tool in their toolbox to build public safety in Burlington.
With the vote totals, shifting over to your chamber. What was the vote at a committee?
The vote out of committee was 3-2-0.
And do you recall what it was on the floor?
I do not recall what it was on the floor. I'm not even sure if it went to, I don't actually even remember if it went to a roll call or not, but I can get you that information.
Or is it, I mean, that's a quick clicker.
Yes.
I can dig that out on my own.
You know what? I think it might have been 17-12.
Oh,
You just needed to give me a minute to dig through all of the other information in my brain.
we all got a lot of rumblings going on in our brain space these days. Rep. Waters Evans.
Do you know how many registered voters there are in Berlin?
I was given that information, but I don't know if it made it into my notes, but if you give me a moment.
I can look it up.
Okay. I do have the information somewhere. But no, not off the top of my head. If I recall, though, the percentage of the vote that turned out in the 2025 town meeting was a little over 30%, which is actually quite high for a town meeting election.
Members of the committee also have the charter packet, the folder that I sent out for you.
Questions for the Senator, Rep. Hooper of Burlington.
Somewhere this afternoon.
Yeah. Did you in committee discuss, when we did the guns and hospital bills, we excluded people who were carrying firearms under the license of the Secretary of State's office? We seem to have done the same thing here. Private investigators, people who might be working at bar as private security. Is there discussion on that?
We did not discuss that, and what we actually heard from the interim chief of police is that that would not be his preference to have that exception, that in an instance where there's alcohol and heightened people, less guns is always better, was his direct quote.
Effectively, we excluded some people from doing their job. Like the thing that caused me to think about it was going in the hospital one day and seeing the people that drive the armored car trucks going fully armed under the Secretary of State's office.
Certainly worth having a conversation, but like I said, following the suggestion of the person who is going to be tasked to uphold this and the person who is, representing the people who are most likely to have to engage in instances where there's violence in bars, we went the path of listening to the chief of police's recommendation, but I certainly think that could be explored.
Hands for the Senator. Thank you for your time.
Absolutely. Happy to answer any questions as they come up.
Appreciate that. So take a couple of minutes here and see if we have any questions for the council. And I see a hand. Council, do you want to join us back up if you don't mind, sir?
Really exciting question about the permits. Can you explain, so when you were talking about the ones that were the exemptions from this, you said a sampling event permit is not an exception, but a special event serving permit is exempted? Can
So
you touch again on the difference between those two?
absolutely.
You don't mind? Thank you.
So to orient the committee to the question, if you take a look on page 2 at subdivision 1C, there are 3 types of limited duration permits that are granted exceptions. So exceptions are granted to limited event permits. So Spring Onion Festival, special event permits, stalls, pop-ups, limited duration locations where a manufacturer is offering their products, or a special event serving permit. Museums, art galleries, retail establishments. What is not included in that list is what is known as a sampling event permit. The distinction between the sampling event permit and all the other permits we've just gone through is that sampling events have the primary purpose of offering alcohol. That would be your wine fest, brew fest. I don't know if there's a distiller's fest, but we'll say that there is. Those are sampling events.
So the exemption would apply to, let's say, a concert, an outdoor concert that has a beer area. That's,
Yes, and that beer area may have one of, I don't know, 4 or 5 different permits that would fall under some of these exceptions.
Any other questions for Tucker?
No train or boat related.
I mean, I was like, I was gonna lead into that one, in regards to,
Essex Junction at 6 PM and there's another train heading in the other direction, a promotional dining car serving tasting permit, what happens?
that is a wonderful setup to the question. Yeah, how does that, how would those pieces intersect coming in and out of a municipality in a structure such as that, or? Uh-huh. So I guess we'll start with trains, then I'm curious also about the boats.
So there's a few different legal issues here. So the first is that the licensee, in all likelihood, is going to be posting their serving area, and the licensee is going to know whether they are, for example, a dining car holding a promotional railroad tasting permit, or whether they're a first or third class licensee that is subject to the ban. Second, Eric Fitzpatrick will talk about it, but there's also the knowing possession standard. It comes into play where the actual individual possessing the firearm, in order to fall under the ban and potential penalty, has to hit that threshold. And Eric can give you some examples of when that might come into play. And then the final point, which in a way maybe makes all of this moot, is that to the best of our knowledge and research, all of the train services that might be captured by this already have policies and provisions relating to the storage of firearms on the train. So it kind of becomes a moot point anyway, because the passengers are not supposed to be, at least from the research we did, moving between the cars possessing firearms.
Rep. Ismail?
I understand what a special event permit is and a special event serving permit, but what would be a limited event?
The limited event is that, I keep using festivals as an example, which might not be helpful, but that's the reason that the light permits were split a couple of years ago. It would be a festival that is dedicated to some other purpose besides serving alcohol, but that has alcoholic beverages available at the festival. So if it is the banjo festival that happens to have a serving area where they're offering wine for the folks listening to the lovely banjo tunes, then they would have a limited event permit, which I believe has a cap of 4 days on it, just like the other permits. Designated serving area monitored by the Division of Liquor Control. The sampling event permit, large festival space dedicated to the service of alcohol with individual vendors participating in the permitted event space.
Well, just as a town clerk, I've never seen a limited event permit issued. I've seen special event permits, which is like our Forest Festival that we have.
Yes.
And we have vendors there that are selling alcohol as well, so they get the first class and the third class. And a special event is like a wedding. It's being catered, so you can carry a gun to those events.
Rep. Brewer?
Under which category is it? Champlain Health Fair? No.
Good question. I would have to look into what sorts of permits the vendors are pulling within that event space. I would assume that each of those vendors holds a special event permit, right? So the one important distinction to make with all of these events, as it's come up over the last few biennia, is that the permit that is going to be accessed for the space is dependent on who is seeking to serve the alcoholic beverages. In the case of like the expo, it is not the expo board or whatever nonprofit or corporation is running it that is seeking to serve the alcoholic beverages. It is a vendor who is renting space that is acquiring a permit to serve alcoholic beverages. That would be the beer tent.
One of the other pieces I was looking at was what is it? One sub B, sidewalks and public highways that pass through an outside premises for which a license holds an outside consumption permit. So if I'm digesting that correctly, right? So you have a defined outdoor consumption area. The seating abuts the brick and mortar licensed operator. And then perhaps in like the parking spaces, they'll have another space. So is this saying that folks that are passing through that defined consumption area are not subject?
I will be careful with the passing through the defined.
Yes.
This is making sure that, let's use Church Street as a concrete example. It is a pedestrian highway, right? You have people walking through Church Street, but in between the serving area and then the defined outside boundary, you still have sidewalks that are passing through. That sidewalk area is accepted from the ban. And that ensures that pedestrian traffic passing through any of these spaces where they are allowed to pass through and that is not within that defined roped off serving area doesn't fall under the ban.
So would it be the purchase and consumption of a alcoholic beverage would initiate them being in the space?
No. It is the actual defined space itself. And this fits pretty squarely also with the knowing standard, right? Even on Church Street where you have bisecting walkways between buildings and outside serving areas, there are defined boundaries where individuals are being served. To my knowledge, that's also required by the department's rules governing these outside consumption permits, is that the serving area has to be defined.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's something we should talk to the DLL about as well. Okay, I think that's what I have. More questions for, yes,
Well,
please.
Just
No.
an outside, when you are issued an outside consumption permit, you have to specify where it's going to be. And whether it be under a tent or an adjacent to the sidewalk, fenced off and the square footage and all that. So I believe that you could go there, would knowingly be carrying and sit down and outside and order something. Because then you're now in you're in their territory of their permit. You can walk through, as if you went to another restaurant or a store adjacent to them and knowingly carry, but you can't actually sit down and consume within that territory, because that's part of their permit. All right.
Confirmed.
I was just going to say what Tucker said earlier, that don't even have to consume. If you are in that cordoned off space, you will not be allowed to carry. Right.
That is correct.
Okay.
That is,
And I think the three of us were all kind of touching on the same concept and then, yeah, okay.
Oh, that's not what it says. That's
The-
exemption.
Boat question?
Like,
you have a boat
Yeah.
motion?
Just like Spirit of Ethan Allen and like, those event boats, like when they leave, is it the boat itself that holds the license? So even though it goes out into the water, which is not the city of Burlington. I guess,
Sometimes not even the state of Vermont
Right.
out there.
yes,
The license for the Spirit of Ethan Allen is issued for the city of Burlington. If you go to the DLL website, and there's not an exception here for first or third class licenses issued to boats or trains. They're both captured.
okay. Understood. I'm still scanning words. Any other questions? No. All right. Thank you so much. Well, I'm sorry, was that, no, that was just.
I'm babbling to myself because I'm making a list.
Twice.
I am very much the same person, representative. Okay, so I guess we'll just stop with this here. We'll reach out to Mr. Fitzpatrick and we'll start thinking about some other folks to speak to regarding further testimony on this at some point, probably next week. But with that, I don't have anything further for council or further for this conversation. And if no one else does, we'll call it until we return after the floor, 15 minutes after floor for